Hello again and very welcome to the chapter about heroic defense. With heroic defense, I'm referring to overcoming some huge difficulties in defensive situations. For example, our king is very exposed and perhaps the only way out is to expose him even more. It's about finding a number of only moves in a row, difficult situations, unpleasant cases where you really need to keep a cool head to find the only way out. A lot of calculation is required. This kind of thinking, we are mainly using it in middle game positions where we are under an attack, but you can actually also use it, I would say, in some difficult endgames as well. And I have a few examples touching upon that situation as well. So let's have a look at our first example. We are playing with the white pieces. This is a game between Gokar Khan with white and Amin, strong grandmaster from Egypt, with the black pieces. You can see that it's a kind of position where nobody really likes to be in white's shoes. Black has just played rook f5. It's easy to see what Black is up to here. Of course, they would like to play rook g5 next turn, and we would be caught in a mating net. We couldn't go to f1 because of queen h1 mate, and if we go to the other side with king h2, they would take on f2, and as you can see, if our king goes up, I think it's mated on g3, and if it goes down instead, it will be mated on h4. So very dangerous. Also, you can see that black has an extra rook, which is also ready to join the attack at some moment. So what do you think? What to do with white here? We can't really prevent rook g5 if we move our knight. There aren't many good squares for the knight. One problem is that also the knight is currently blocking black along the f file. So if you play something like knight e5, unfortunately, black will take on f2 and we get mated here, I think, king h1, rook h5. So impossible. In order to save this kind of position, you really need to think away from, what can I say, bad feelings, sentimental problems. You would say, oh, I don't like this is very dangerous, I'm going to get mated. You have to keep your head cool and just try to avoid defeat. That's the key thing here. So what Gokar Khan did in this game, in the first place, he noticed that since rook g5 can't be prevented and king f1 will run into queen h1, that means that most probably our king must go to the h-file. And for that reason, if the king goes to the h-file, we cannot protect, we cannot lose this pawn on f2, we have to protect it. That's what I wanted to say. And in this sense, our next move is not difficult to understand. We should bring in the rook. It's very important to bring all the pieces here to the party. I think if you use the bishop instead, it will just invite black to take, and it would be worse version of this, right? We could bring in the rook, and it would be basically the same kind of mate as before. Bishop e3, rook takes e3. So rook f1, very clever move, the last friend to the party. Mobilization to the defense. We will look at this interesting topic a little later, I think in chapter 20. Let's see what happened in the game. White defended the pawn, black played, I think, rook g5, and white hurried to play here king h2. At this point, as you can see, no checks really for black. They played in the game rook g4, easy move to understand. Of course, rook h4 coming up next, rook h1 is made. So how do you think we could prevent that? Is there any way to we can't really prevent, we can't touch the square, on h4, but we can do something about it, right? Aha, you got it. We can play here the move rook g1. In the first place, we wouldn't like to play this because we are dropping the pawn on f2, but there was no other choice, really. There was no other move for white. As far as I can see, there is definitely no move. A move, by the way, that we would like to play at some occasion is queen c3, but this is definitely not the right moment for that. So rook g1, only move. The pawn on f2, we will have to give it away. We can't think about pawns when we are saving our king and so on. So queen takes f2, and again, we have to make a choice here, but this one is simpler. Yeah, the method of elimination. By elimination, we can see that we cannot put a knight there because exactly we get mated in one move. So we will have to put our rook there instead. Rook g2 is what Gokar Khan played. By the way, this is not some strange computer variation. It's exactly how the game went. Turkish international master handled the position perfectly here. Rook g2, and after queen h4, he simply played here king g1. I think this was the last pitfall. Yeah, last pitfall, because if you play knight h3, as we were discussing, sometimes black's other rook can join the battle, so they could play something like rook takes, king takes, and I think queen g4, and next turn, next turn the king goes back to h2 and the rook comes to e2. So this had to be avoided, but okay, white, they kept their head cool here and they played simply king g1. Took on g2, rook takes, and you can take on g2 in two different ways, but generally speaking, I would recommend that you keep this picture in mind, where you have knight and bishop on the same color, some kind of barrier that we're using here. King takes d2, which means that we're actually covering a great number of squares. So you can see that, for example, on the e file, the bishop and the knight together, they're covering several important squares. So maybe you can get away with knight takes d2, but I would definitely prefer to take in this way. Interestingly, even if there are no pawns shielding white's king, the king is actually rather safe here. Black played in the game rook e5. Yeah, queen check, we can probably just play king f2. So rook e5 was played in the game, and white found a nice move here. I think there were several choices, but I like the way they played, because they played queen c7. And suddenly, even white is having some slight chances here, because also black's king is starting to look a little exposed. Black played queen g4 and white played king f2. Actually, the king is not in such a big danger here as we are discussing. These pieces are very, very useful. The bishop and the knight is kind of barrier. I think also they could have given check with the rook, but it wouldn't be a big difference. You could play something like king f3. Very difficult to catch white's king in the mating net with a knight controlling several squares. Sometimes the king can even move away to that side. So actually black should be a little careful. After queen g4, king f2, later on this game ended in a draw. So very nice defensive effort by Gokar Khan in this example. You can see that his task was not exactly easy, but by accurate defense, good calculation, he managed to save his king here. It was very important to bring in the rook to defend this pawn, since after rook g5, king h2, we didn't want to lose this pawn. But paradoxically speaking, when black played rook g4, then actually it was time to lose this pawn. I think that's kind of interesting. A little detail, the rook went this way instead, and now we get ready to play rook g1. We have to play it, because else black plays rook h4. So finding some only moves, and after queen takes f2, the only move here was to play rook g2. So I think it was like 3 or 4 only moves in a row, something like that. White was up to the task and correctly saved a draw here. Let's have a look at our next example, which is much more complex, but on the same topic. We have here with the white pieces Zhou Zhangyi, and playing black is Sindarov. Wow, look at this position. Rook f6 was just played. It's easy to see what black has on their mind here. Rook h6 check, not so much to take white's queen, but actually in order to mate them with queen takes g2. That would be black's idea here. I mean, rook to f6, and we can mate in one with queen takes g2, or we could take first, and after, king takes h2, then we would mate with queen takes g2. On the other hand, we should of course look at the whole board here, not only at the king side. You can see on the queen side that white is basically winning there. They have a very strong passed pawn. The rook is also very well placed on the 7th rank. You can see there are some back rank issues, but first white needs to survive black's assault on the king side. But I'm telling you this because I want you to take into account that in this kind of situation, of course, you should be ready to give back material. We should be ready to give the queen for a rook and knight, for example, because in that case, we have our own trumps on the queen side, so we shouldn't be too materialistic here. But okay, first step is to save our skin. There is a clear threat of rook h6. We don't have many choices here, as you can see. We have basically 2 queen moves, which will help the king to get to a safer spot, and we have to choose between these two. And I would say that the less obvious move is the stronger one, because for me at least, queen f1 looks more natural, because I see some picture that if I put my queen on f2, there will be something with rook h6 and knight h3 check, forking my 2 pieces here. But anyway, in this context of the heroic defense, like I was saying, calculation is really top priority. So we can't be too intuitive or too sentimental here. We will have to keep our head cool again. Queen f1 would be a bad choice here, because black has the move after rook h6, king g1. They won't give this check, believe it or not. They have a much stronger move here. Silent move in the attack. You got it. Queen g3. That's a pretty move. What's going on? Well, black's main idea here is to give check. Give check on h3 and f2, and then deliver mate with rook h1. This is the reason why they play queen g3, because if they go knight h3 straight away, white will play king f2 and king h2, sorry, and it wouldn't be the same thing. So very nice move, queen g3. Definitely Zhou Zhangyi noticed this and played for that reason queen f2 instead. All right, black gave check with rook h6. They stick to their plan. I also checked another idea which I thought was interesting. Queen h6 check, and after king g1, knight h3. This looks like also black is about to win this game because white loses their queen. But it isn't that serious. After g takes, you can see that if rook g6 doesn't make sense due to king h2, but if they take first, here you will have to give up your queen. This is just the way things are. There is the very strong threat of rook g6, so you have only one move here, away, bad feelings and so on. Queen g2, exactly. This is the way to play, and if they go rook g6, we will take, of course. And after h takes g6, we can take on b7. I think we take with the rook, right? Because we can't take with the pawn, then we lose the rook. So we should take with the rook, I think. Yeah, rook takes is better. And here you can see white has a material advantage. They have a strong threat at some point of playing c7, unless somehow the rook falls off, but they can maybe prepare this, or maybe like put the rook there and then go c7. So definitely the one who's trying to save their skin here is black. So very interesting variation. Let's go back to the very beginning. Queen f2, we are looking at the variation. Queen h6 check, king d1, knight h3. Looks very promising. G takes, queen takes with idea rook g6. However, white would play the unnatural move, unpleasant move, queen g2, but it's very strong because we would like to trade off, I would say, a take on g6. Of course, black can also play queen e3, targeting the rook on a7, but in that case, after king f1, queen takes a7, we get counterplay. Yeah, let's think for a moment about black's king also. You got it. We can play here queen g5, and it's an interesting position. You can see some checks coming up and so on. Not completely clear what's going on here, but white has also their fair share of the chances. So let's go back to the game. Queen f2, black played rook h6, and after king g1, of course, if knight h3, this had to be checked in advance. So it would be easy if we don't know this concept, if you're not familiar with heroic defense, you will just say, oh, I lost here, I can't play this, I'll have to play something else. But it's important to live with, to put up with these unpleasantnesses and be able to handle them, I would say, like almost psychologically, not getting too affected by them. So king f1, yeah, that's evidently the best move here, so that knight takes f2 doesn't come with check, and at this point we have no reason to take the knight. If you, just like me, play the bug house when you were a kid, you remember that sometimes you shouldn't take those pieces in front of your king. It's better to go for your own attack. C takes b7, and actually white is probably winning here because we have two very strong threats and black can't really make their attack work. As you can see, rook h1, we can just take on f2, and I think they're out of checks here, or out of good checks. So nice play here by Zhou Zhangyi. King g1, not afraid of knight h3, not seeing any ghosts. Black played correctly here, sinned out of rook g6, of course, now targeting the pawn on g2. So what do you think? Should we defend that pawn, or should we do something else? That's right, we will have to move away the king here. That's not an easy choice to make. In the first place, please notice that bishop f1, I think it would fail to knight h3. This is already a different story. Black would have a winning attack here after knight takes next turn. If instead you stick to the white attack with c takes b7 after rook takes g2, king f1, this would be like the right spirit. It's the right spirit to defend, but I think tactically the problem is that the rook drops off in the end, right? We take on f2, we give check on g2, and no matter where white's king goes, there is queen g1 and queen takes a7. So that's taking it a little too far. The best move here is what Zhou Zhangyi played, king f1. We should run away with the king now. Rook takes g2, and I think here comes the most interesting part in this example. It's already very interesting, but the next move is really spectacular in my opinion, because you would say that black's attack is very strong, but white is currently defending. Perhaps your first impression here would say that, okay, I should of course make sure that they don't give check on g1. I'll put my queen somewhere along this diagonal, let's say queen e3. But that would be a huge mistake, because here we get mated. Not on g1, but they will play, you got it, like the good old staircase mate with the rooks. They will play here queen h6, and queen h1 is coming next. What a disaster. So he saw through this, and he said, all right, I can actually live with this move. I can live with the unpleasantness is coming up here, rook g1, queen g2, and he played here Zhou Zhangyi, queen h4. I must say, this is just fantastic. It's definitely beyond my level, but I'm trying to learn also, and I'm learning from this example. Rook g1 check, king f2, queen g2 and king e3. Under normal circumstances, this could never work, but Zhu Jiangyi calculated very well, and he noticed that actually black, they don't have a good check here. You can see that rook e1 is impossible, or queen is covering that square. And yeah, there aren't any other very good checking possibilities for black. And at the same time, also you can see that white is doing something with the queen, right? So fantastic, fantastic discovery. I mean, you and me, we are moving the pieces here, but imagine in the game to see all this mentally on your board. That's truly impressive. Knight e5 is one move that you had to check. Some funny variations here. Knight takes d5, f4. Not clear how far Zhu Jiangyi calculated here, but he would definitely find his way here. Knight takes f4. Yeah, that's about the only move here to avoid mate. I think mate was coming up maybe with queen takes or rook d1 if we move the king to that side. So it's better to take. And after pawn takes, we can just take with the queen. Incredibly enough, they don't have any obvious continuation here. What did I look at here? Queen takes b2, so that we cover the long diagonal, we don't get mated. However, white can give up material here. We talked about that. This is a dangerous situation for white. The checks are still around, so we can actually give up material. Queen f8 checks, so that the rook checks. Rook g8, we take on g8. Queen takes, rook takes, king takes, sorry. Rook takes g8 and king takes g8. Yeah, I'm getting carried away by this example. And now we should take on b7. I think you could take with the rook, you could take with the pawn. I would take with the rook though. But all right, it seems when I checked this was better. It seems black cannot really get at our rook. But else I would also think actually that rook takes b7 is fine. We have counterplay material is almost equal. So this would also be promising, I think. But okay, technically speaking, c takes b7 was the strongest move, and I think black will have to go for a perpetual here because also rook a8 is threatened. So that's what would have happened if black sacked piece temporarily with knight d5. In the game, Sindarov played queen takes b2. Now there are simply very many threats around white's king. So not surprisingly, white went for a perpetual here. You can carry it out in different ways. You can start with queen d8 or queen f6 in the game. Zhu Jiangyi started with queen f6, and after rook g7, you can give checks on both sides. He played in the game queen f8 and rook g8, queen f6. So very impressive work. He saved the draw here. Proud king, you could say, a brave way of using the king. We don't really get scared by those black pieces, but I think this situation, in 9 cases of 10, the position that we had here after king e3 here, this wouldn't work now in 9 cases of 10. But of course the big challenge is to detect that 10th case where we can actually get away with this. I wanted to say also that there was something with the move order. Yeah, that I wanted to say. If we just go over this very quickly again. So queen f2 only move after rook h6, check, king g1, black played rook g6. Yeah, this is what I wanted to say, that he played in the game king f1. But you could also use like the king move here, the topic of chapter 10, I think. You can use this also. Sorry, the opposite way. He used king f1 like the king move, but you can also play the other way around. You can start with queen h4, and if rook takes g2, you go king f1. This would transpose to the game. That's what I wanted to say. The point still being here, rook g1, king f2. Incredibly enough, queen g2, king e3. White can get away with this. All right, let's take our next example. This is this time with the black pieces. Another very, very tough case. It's with white pieces, Søndergaard, and playing black is Rasmussen. Game played in the Danish championship some years ago. As you can see, Søndergaard has all his pieces in the attack, basically. You have the proud bishop pair here, very powerful. Blackburn's bishops, they say, I think. And also you have the knight and the queen, and even the rook is ready to attack. But at the same time also, of course, white's king is slightly exposed. But okay, I would say that these 3 pieces, they make a very funny impression. They're not really aiming at the right place, are they? So what's going on here is that white's about to deliver mate. If you play something like bishop takes e1, just for the sake of clarity, white has so many pieces in the attack. The balance between attacking and defending forces is disastrous for black, so white could just play something like knight f6, sacrifice the way through here. As you can see, if g takes queen g4, and that is bishop takes f6 mate coming up. If king h8, white would now focus on the h7 pawn instead. They would play something like queen e4, I think, or queen h5. Yeah, which would be the strongest? Good question. Yeah, queen e4 maybe. That looks good to me. There is only one check, but we have king. Wait. Queen d2, king here, and queen d1. Maybe we shouldn't allow this, or maybe we can get away with it. yeah, it seems we can actually get away with it, right? But it's not what we wanted because the bishop was sidetracked from that diagonal. I think actually white, they don't need to be that fast in the attack. Maybe you could just play something like rook takes e1 also. This seems to be much simpler. And you keep all the options open here on the king side. You could perhaps just take this pawn and continue the attack. There are many ideas here for white with so many pieces in the attack, evidently. So yeah, that's what could have happened if black just takes on e1. It's difficult to believe that black can get away with that. I looked at a number of moves here. For example, f5 is one idea to block the bishop, but in that case, knight e5 is painful for black. You can see there are ideas with queen e6 coming up. So what happened in the game? Let's say in the game he took on d5. He took on d5, but you can now guess what white played. Of course, they played knight f6. So g takes, we know the story. It's going to be mate. Queen g4 and bishop takes f6 in that case. So black will have to play king h8, and I think here Søndergaard, he found a nice move here. He played queen h5. So threat of mating 1, and if h6, I think it's queen. Is it queen f5? Feel like we're mating them, right? Queen f5, that must be a good move. Threatening to give mate, and if they move the pawn to g6, I think we can just use some knight move here, right? Something like knight takes d5, and we have a strong attack coming up. There might be something else better than what I'm telling you, but it's safe to say very, very dangerous to play this with the black pieces. Also, perhaps you could play, if h6, you could play knight takes d5 straight away. I was thinking also with this threat, but okay. Now queen f5 might be good enough. If bishop d2, is this the game? No, this is probably another variation. Oh, so I looked at this also. Let's see here. Sorry, I lost my way a little in the variations. If e takes d5, knight f6 check, and after king h8, queen h5. It seems that this is what happened in the game. Black played bishop d2, trying to bring the bishop to the defense, king b1, h6, so that there are no options with queen takes h6, but white played queen f5 since after g6. Oh, so that's how it goes. Knight takes d5. You can see the strong discovery of the check, and king h7. What do you think white will play? That's right, queen f6. So many mating patterns for white that they can work on. Not surprising that something good comes out of that. So you can see this one is coming, and that one is also in the air, and so on if black moves the rook to g8. All right, what do you think then? How can we possibly save black's king here? If this is a threat, that would be my way of thinking. If this is a threat, we should try to cover that square somehow. f6 is also a possible move. I think this is better than the rest. Here they had this nice move, knight c5. There's so many sacrifices, but please don't be surprised by that, because white has such a big advantage as for attacking forces versus defending forces. Pawn takes, queen takes e6. One thing that you should remember though, black is covering this square, so forget about back rank mate for now. King h8, queen h6, that's a pretty picture that you have seen in tactics books and so on. Double mating threat, that's usually one threat too much for the defender to handle. So very difficult situation for black. The only way out here is to, in the first place, cover this square on f6. So we have to use the knight for that, knight d7. I'm convinced that Rasmussen, he looked at this in the game, because it's a very intuitive move, bringing a knight closer to the battle, trying to save the king. But he must have noticed that here knight c5 is very unpleasant for black. You should notice, by the way, d takes e6 will only help black, because in that case black's queen will be covering this square. So just f takes, and black is happier than ever. Now that there is also some extra space for the king and also for the rook. This is a little connected, I would say, to the defensive pawn breaks that we will look at later in chapter 25 or 26, something like that, about pushing a pawn in front of your king to help the king. We'll come back to that. So knight e7, that's what they should have played. Knight e5 looks very dangerous. The pawn is now hanging, but black could try to play here the move g6. And I think that what he noticed during the game was this very beautiful move, queen h5, which is actually our main line here. It looks very beautiful, because if d takes h5, you have the pretty mate bishop takes h7, right? However, sometimes when you go for this kind of very pretty combination, sacking the queen, your position also becomes a bit fragile, a bit exposed to intermediate moves, counter sacrifices and things like that. And that's exactly what would happen in this variation, because black actually has a nice way of turning the tables here, and I would like you to find that. So what do you think? How should black counter this threat of queen takes h7 mate, feel free to give up material on the way, okay? That's true. First, we play a move which is difficult to play because it's not clear what it's good for. First, we play knight f6. You could say, of course, that, okay, we can play bishop d2 and after king b1, take on g5. We could do that, but after queen takes g5, strategically, this would be very, very painful for black. You can see that it's really a monster, this bishop on the long diagonal, and they also have ideas like pushing the pawn and so on. Yeah, the only thing they cannot do is this, of course, because the queen is hanging, but maybe they could play like queen h6 first and they would have a strong attack. This, if it's not tactically lost, strategically it's going to be very difficult. But there is a nicer option here for black. They can first play seemingly incomprehensible move knight f6, so that when white takes on f6, now suddenly white's queen is a little exposed, right? Sorry, white's king is a little exposed. So how do you think black can take advantage of that? Aha, bishop d2 check, and after king b1, we will play here queen b4. The check itself doesn't seem that useful because white could just go back with the bishop, right? But since we have some kind of dependence here, white is sacking the queen to make this mate work. One little thing that changes in the position might have a huge impact. So that's what's going to happen here. White, yeah, they cannot play king a1 because we give check and then we take the queen. Then we win, right? Because their bishop is not on the board anymore. After bishop takes, queen takes, and next turn we take their queen. So they will have to go back with the bishop, and I'm convinced that you know which is the next move here, right? Of course, about giving back material. That's exactly the right moment. We still have this mating threat hanging over us, so we play here queen takes b2 check. After king takes b2, g takes h5, you can see that material, even if it's not that important, you can see it's about equal. But also black, they have some threats. The rook is in the air, the knight is in the air. Nobody cares about the pawn on h7 when there are not queens around and so on. So black will probably be even better here in this position. So that was the very surprising way in which black could have saved this position. If we look at it again, it was about, in the first place, preventing knight f6. We do that by knight d7, mobilizing the knight to the defense, but we had to see this complex variation, knight g5, and we go with g6 first. I think you can play also knight f6. This is possible, but I think it gave white, they have a very interesting move here. Well, the difficult thing about this example is that white has so many different ways to attack. So even for white, it's difficult to see which is the best way. Should we focus on h7 or g7 or perhaps even f7? Here they have this very surprising move, queen e5. What's the point? Well, they would like to take on h7 because in that case, as you can see, the battery would mean that they can deliver mate on g7. This would be dangerous for black, even if you could take on e1, you could then play with white. I think knight takes h7, right? This would still be dangerous. Yeah, crazy position. No, I don't know what's going on here, but I think this could be okay for white. No, it cannot be okay for white. Black is completely winning. What am I missing then? Let's check again. Maybe you should just take back on e1. Yeah, I think that's the point. Again, I'm making the same mistake. I should take it slowly here and just take first. And I think I keep all my options here. Knight takes h7 or even bishop takes h7 is going to be a threat here. So that's the dark side if you play knight f6 first. So it's better to start with g6. And here, as we were discussing here, after queen h5. By the way, knight takes h7, that's another typical textbook example. If you take with a king, you get mated after queen h5, but black has no reason to cooperate like that. You could play simply rook e8. Interesting. In this way, you open up some space for your king. So queen h5, this is the key moment here. You have two ways to continue. Either you play knight f6, as we just looked at, or the other different move order. You start with bishop d2, but you don't take the knight. We talked about that. It's strategically not so nice for black, but you can also here play knight f6, which will lead to the same thing. So here after bishop takes f6, you know the trick, of course. We should now give check and get ready to give back the material here, sack the queen. Queen b4 check and give back. Or it's not even giving back, right? It's some kind of temporary sacrifice. Bishop b2, queen takes b2, after king takes, g takes h5. We have saved our skin, but please don't tell me that this was easy to see at the board. I would say it's quite the opposite. Very tough situation, very difficult to see all this, navigate through all these complexities. But if we should take away something from this example, is about the fact that we have these like counter-attacking ideas with bishop d2 and queen b4. Don't think that we are just lost here because they have so many pieces in the attack. but you need to really calculate thoroughly to make this work, and you have to use each and every tactical resource at your disposal here. So knight e7, and after queen h5, g6, the difficult move here. Sorry, I'm thinking about the next example already. Sorry, this is not the same thing. Yeah, so knight e5 and g6, queen h5. The key move here, which was difficult to see in the very beginning, was knight f6. Sorry, for this to work out, you need to understand that you can later on sack the queen on b2. Very, very complex. All right, we'll take our next example. In this example, the player was actually successful. Christopher Yu playing white and playing black dragon. You can see that white is again, white in this case, the defender is again in huge trouble. So many black pieces attacking. Look, fantastic position for black. Look how many pieces. Now you have the bishop, you have the queen already on the king side, the two knights, the rook, and if it's not enough, also the other rook is ready to join the battle. You would say that white is outnumbered already at this point. And it is. Technically speaking, it's a difficult position for white, but you found the only way out. The bull by the horns, they say. That's what he played here after black's last move, knight e5. He actually took on e5, which, we understand the move, of course. They cannot take back because they're hanging their queen. But you would say, hey, you can't play like that. It's going to happen something on f2 now. You take, and then they'll take on h2 once the bishop takes, and you get mated on g2 and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, please avoid too much feelings. Just make sure that you calculate this properly. By the way, there were other moves for white, of course, in this case. Bishop e4 is a typical move in this case, but black's greater number of attacking pieces means that they can consider sacrifices. One nice option here for black is to take on f3, knight takes check. Yeah, we can't really take with the bishop. It would be the same thing, but we would then have additional problems. So g takes, and here we have the nice sacrifice. Knight takes h2. Very pretty. Again, like in the previous example, when you have so many pieces in the attack, they are like raining possibilities. In this case, as you can see, if bishop takes, black would just play, I think, rook h6, right? And they're mating, I think. But there are also some features like, yeah, how can I explain this? Like in some variations where you put the bishop here and they can like take it because there is this pin on the g1, a7 diagonal. But okay, all right, this is not necessary here. Rook h6 just wins on the spot, I think. So bishop e4 is not really convincing. What you played in the game was knight takes e5. But by doing so, when doing so, he really had to calculate thoroughly the consequences. In the game, black played rook takes f2. That's perfectly understandable. They're toying with this idea of the overloaded bishop on g3. They could have taken with the bishop also. I had a look at this. Rook takes f2, rook takes f2, looks devastating, looks like white should resign already. Bishop takes, queen takes, followed by queen takes g2. Don't forget the sniper bishop on b7. However, white could actually play very nice fashion here, bishop f1, simply defending the pawn on g2. Very nice. What black could do here to pick up a pawn would be rook takes f1. Now that after queen takes f1, they can take on e5. They would win a pawn, but okay, I would say a pawn, it's peanuts here. We can live with that in order to save our king. I think the computer was proposing this move, interesting move. Queen d1, you can see what white is up to here. They would like to trade queens, and after taking back, there will be some kind of dependency. The pawn on d7 will be weak, so white will have at least chances for a draw here. So back to the game. They played in the game knight takes e5, and black took on the f2 with a rook, which is more powerful or more testing because we keep the pressure on this diagonal. So only move rook takes f2, bishop takes f2. We already know that taking on f2 would be very bad for white. They get mated here after queen takes, king moves, queen takes, king moves, and queen takes. So we can't play that. What you played was king f1. So far, so good. What did Dragon calculate then? Well, he had noticed, of course, that in this case, he wouldn't give mate, but he would pick up white's queen. So that's what happened in the game. He played here knight e3. There were some other moves also. One of the most interesting lines was if rook f8. Imagine having this position at the board. Crazy, no? But you can save your skin here. Knight takes d4. Very unexpected. Black has no good discoveries. Bishop takes. We can just come back, and we are okay, it seems, in this position. We're actually piece up, no? Yeah, so this would be okay for white, as far as I can see. So in the game, after king f1, black played the more obvious move, knight e3. King takes f2, knight takes d1, and after rook takes d1, we have actually arrived at a kind of material relation that you remember from the game between Lalic and Hulak in the example about, in the chapter about the process of elimination. We saw this kind of situation also. And it's interesting. It's always an interesting battlefield, you could say, where you have three minor pieces versus a queen. If you can get to coordinate those pieces well, they can actually put up a lot of resistance. They might not even be worse than the queen. And here, black has, I think, at least one pawn. I think they were able to get another pawn. But even so, you can see that white has chances here. Let's see how the game continued. They played in the game d6, and Christopher Yu went back with the knight to f3 after rook f4. Sorry, rook f8. You can see there is a threat against the knight on f3. There were different options here. I think the computer wanted to play bishop e2, so that we also keep track of this pawn. White seems to be okay in this position, but in the game, all right, they played knight e4. But I like his choice also. He's like anti-materialistic. He sees that he might lose this pawn, but you get an active game, and that's what counts here. So bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, queen c5 check, king e2, queen takes c4, and bishop d3. Objectively, black is better here, but after queen d4, still white has plenty of chances. I would say in this position, the pieces are rather well organized. White played at this point the move king e3, interesting, in order to unpin the knight. Black tried e5 at this point. It's funny that no matter how you advance these pawns, they create some kind of weakness now. So when black played e5 here, white quickly played bishop e4. Very nice. Strategically speaking, some kind of blockade. You can see that the pawn is weak, and we have like a stronghold on d5 for our pieces. So white later on managed to make a draw in this game, which is a good result given the difficulties that they were facing at the very beginning here. So very nice play by Christopher Yu. He really walked down the thin path, you could say, to save this game. The bull by the horns, knight takes e5, that's the first thing to check. Don't reject this move because it looks dangerous. You have to look into the tactics. That's a concept that we are investigating here, the heroic defense. We will have to suffer, but we will in the end hopefully come out victorious, or at least make a draw here. Rook takes f2, rook takes f2, bishop takes f2, and we have to understand that king f1 must be played, and we are ready to enter this situation with the queen less, but three minor pieces. Knight e3, king takes f2, knight takes d1, rook takes d1. Computers may say what they want, but we still have a chance here as long as we are facing another human. Evidently, white is just slightly worse, probably in this position. So nice defensive play by Christopher Yu. All right, our next example is a really mind-boggling one. This is what sometimes happens in the King's Indian. When you're playing the King's Indian with with black, white plays on the queen side, they break through on the queen side. You can see that black's, well, it likes the completely ruins on the queen side, right? There are no pieces anymore on black's queen side. White's about to queen. But look at the king side, please. Yeah, what's going on here? White is getting mated here very soon. You can see that there is no mate in one, but almost. No, almost mate. We can cook up mate in three if you like. You know, queen h2, king f2, queen g3, king g1, and rook h1. That should be just one of them. No, so you can see that white is definitely in big danger here in this example. I think if you play the most obvious move, I was thinking about that. If you take, I think you get mated, right? I think you can give check on h2, king f1, queen h1, king f2, and you play rook h2, right? That's a mate. So yeah, white is definitely in trouble. Only a very precise play here with white pieces will make them save their skin and perhaps even win the game. But you really have to be inventive to find this. So let's have a look. I checked some different options. If you run away with the king, well, queen h4, the queen will tell the king to kindly stay. King takes, and it's mate after queen g3 and rook h1. I looked at bishop d3 also to bring the queen closer, but the silent move here, bishop takes f3, is very powerful. We keep this in the pocket. What else? Not so much, actually. It's time to go for our own attack, and by now you already know the first move, of course, but I'm not sure if you would see the whole continuation because it's very difficult. By the way, playing white, Lauritsen, and playing black, Chakraborty, this was a game, I think, in the title Tuesday, and even so, it's very, very interesting, very high quality. Rook takes f8, that's the first move, of course. Of course, we should include this. It cannot be wrong, you would say. Comparative analysis, we should include this move, of course. It can only bring benefits. So they cannot take, in that case, king takes f8, c8, queen. We get a very strong attack here. You can see that if they try to keep the king protected, white can actually give back material here. After knight e8, we could take this pawn, but I think even stronger is to take on e8, so that we either deflect black's queen from the attack. You can see that if queen takes, we could perhaps just take on g2, something like queen takes, king takes, the queen comes back, and we will have to help our king to escape. You got it. We should play something like this and prepare an escape to the other side. So queen takes is very clever here. Queen takes, if you have two queens but you're getting mated, why not give up one of the queens? If they take with the king instead, they keep their attack going, but now it's our turn to have some fun here. Queen takes f4, and we are invading with all our pieces. You can see that for yourself. There are many checks coming up now for white. So black, after the move rook takes f8, they really have to play king g7. Now, if you remember the chapter number 6, was it 6 or maybe 7? We talked about deflecting or distracting the opponent's pieces from the attack, and that's what our next move is about here. So we can't really queen at this point. It's not with check, which means that we are again getting mated here with queen h2 and queen g3, and as you saw, rook h1. So how could you possibly distract one of black's attacking pieces? Aha, you're right. We can give this check on f7. So now either they take with a queen, the queen is distracted, or they take with the king, and we get an extra check, which will prove to have very big benefit. So let's have a look here. If queen takes, we again have a tempo to queen, which means that if black comes back with the queen, it's our time to have fun here. We will attack. King g6 is made, for example, after knight takes e5. So after rook f7, they will have to take back with the king instead. So far, perhaps not so difficult, the example that we are looking at, but now it gets more difficult because, again, queen means, if you queen on c8, it means that we're getting mated, right? The same good old story with queen h2. So we have two other options here, both of which are very natural, you would say. Knight takes e5, in my opinion, the most natural move. However, after king g7, you see the typical magic distance. You put your king in a way that it cannot be checked by the knight anymore. This is how the game went. White tried knight g4, very good try by Lauritsen, covering the square on h2, and I think black, went away here. They played knight takes. Yeah, the game got very complex. Knight takes g4, rook d7, king f6, rook d6, and I think white was winning. But in any case, after the move knight g4, black could actually give mate here. You got it. We start with a check, and after king f2, we take on g4 because now it's with check. And after f takes g4, how do you think black delivers mate? Aha, you better act quickly now, else white will start their attack, so it's not so difficult to see actually. We should play queen h4. So if king takes, we have the well-known mate with queen g3, and at the same time, if you go for king g1, yeah, we know the story by now by heart. Queen h2, king f2, queen g3, and mate on h1. So that's unfortunately what would happen if you give the check on e5. So give the other check, please. Knight e6, and after king g6, black would have to try to find a way to escape further checks. We have arrived at our key move in this example, our key move, which was very difficult to understand. But since we saw this mating pattern so many times, think about which squares did a black queen need to travel along in order to give mate. And you would remember that, oh yeah, these squares are very important. So which move does that lead to? You got it. Incredible, but true. Knight f5, this is the winning move here. Incredibly, because we don't give check. And even so, black can have their check. Now it's their turn to give check, but they can't use it in any good way. Yeah, I still find this is really remarkable. It's similar to Zhu Jiangyi's example. We can expose our king in this way and we can get away with it. So look at this. Queen h2, check, king f2. They can give check whatever they like. But the dangerous checks, the ones on g3 and h4, we have already prevented them thanks to this marvelous knight on f5. So one variation here, bishop takes f3, last piece of accuracy. Please don't take this guy because you get mated now with g4 or maybe rook h3. It's better to run. We should just run in the spirit of the brave king, which we will look at later, this topic in chapter 23, I think. So king e1, and after queen g1 check, we are just in time to move away the king, and white is winning. Actually, material is not that clear. Black has a bunch of pawns for that minus piece, but evidently what settles the matter here is the c pawn. White will win the game thanks to the c pawn. So what a fantastic example how difficult to see this at the board, as you can imagine. Even in a long game, this was a blitz game, but I think even in a long game it would be difficult to see this. But in short, what white needs to do here, they need to sack the rook. After rook takes, king d7, rook f7 to distract black, and after king takes, they need to bring the knight to f5. Knight e6, king g6, knight f5. I think defense doesn't get much more difficult than this. Looks crazy to do something like this because now black can give checks and we haven't even queened. But it turns out that it was so important to keep these two squares with our knight so that we can actually win the position here. We're ready to run with with the king, run away with the king as soon as possible. All right, let's continue. We will have a look at the other situation that I was discussing in the beginning. I mentioned that also in difficult endgames, we can use a little this thinking of facing unpleasantnesses, finding only moves and things like that. And this is what our next example is about. It's a completely different story. You can see that no problems with king safety really for black. The problem is that they're getting destroyed on the queen side. This is a typical English battle, as you can see. Somehow white managed to invade, to infiltrate, and it's very difficult to play black here. Just one thing to notice here is that rook b8 is an imminent threat targeting the pawn on b7. It's a game with white pieces Bogoslavljevic and playing black is Perunovic. And I think you could say Perunovic, unfortunately, he went down without the fight here. He played bishop f5, which is not really related to the position. I guess he wanted to avoid the knight reaching c5 and targeting the bishop, something like that. But here, Bogoslavljevic simply carried out his main threat here, rook b8, and you can see that is no good way of saving this pawn. This pin along the 8th rank is very annoying for black. King g7 was played in the game. Rook takes b7, bishop takes, knight takes. And white went on to win. Rook d6, unfortunately, doesn't take this pawn. This is like our worst enemy. This pawn, we really need to eliminate it, or we would like to eliminate it. But here, white can play knight a4, and they keep their extra pawn. After bishop d7, very precise move here by white. What would you play? Aha, rook c7, very clever move, because in this way we also target the knight. So black resigned here, the pawn is running. If knight takes, obviously, we take and we win a piece here. So that's what could happen if we play bishop f5, which was not the best choice on this occasion. So what do you think? What should we play here in this position? How can we possibly cope with this threat of rook b8? Definitely this does not come with intuition. I would say the best move here is what you would not like to play. That's the best hint I can give you. The next move is what you would avoid. All right, that happens sometimes in chess. The best options are the ones that we don't like at all at the first place. So that's why I'm saying that feelings, you have to put them away on some occasions and just calculate. So what's going on here is that we really need to unpin the rook. If that would happen, well, then we would be able to take the pawn. How could we possibly unpin the rook? That's very difficult, because if you move it to e8, for example, it's still pinned. Now, if you put it here, it's still going to be pinned. White could still, I think, carry out the same plan with just rook b8, or maybe there is something even better. But the way in which we can unpin the rook is by putting the rook on f8. If the rook is there, it's protected by the king, and black would be ready to take on b6. How can we bring the rook to f8? Well, there is only one way. Like it or not, you will have to take on c5. I looked at some other moves also, but this is the only reliable defense. Looks extremely ugly to play like this. However, we can now play rook f8. And as you can see, what looked like a completely winning or very superior position for white, it's actually not so simple anymore, because the pawn is hanging. If black is able to get rid of that pawn, well, we would have pawns only on one side of the board, which would make black's defensive task much simpler. It's not easy to see how white should cope with this knight a4. I think it doesn't make too much sense. You could just play bishop d7, targeting this knight, and you would be ready to take here later on. So what could you play here with white? Rook b8 is another move to check, of course. If knight takes b6, white still has some pressure here, although I was saying that black's task is probably simpler once the pawns disappear on the b file. However, even nicer here is to play another move. You got it, knight e6. That's a nice move, because in this way we trade off the rooks, rook takes, king takes, and we are ready to pick up the pawn later. And I think black is at least equal in this position. You can see that black's king is actually more active than white's. So after rook f8, The most critical choice would be knight takes e6, but it's not really that critical. The problem for black here after f takes e6 is that the pawn is a bit weak on e6, so white could capitalize on this by bishop h3. Here there is a pitfall. The most natural move here, unfortunately, it's not the best. King f7 is what we would like to play. However, white will have this sneaky tactic, rook b8. Targeting the pawn and our intended move knight e6, you got it. It will fail to bishop takes e6. That's how easy it is to go wrong in this kind of tactical complexity. So what do you have to play here? Again, maybe it's not what you would like to do. Sentimentally, you don't like the white bishop to arrive at e6, but okay, that's life. We will have to accept that. Knight takes b6, only choice here. Get rid of that pawn. We can stand that bishop takes e6, king g7, and white is still a little more, they have a little more pleasant position here, you could say, after, let's say, rook a7, perhaps. We would play rook b8. They could go rook a5 and we can go rook d8. We're kind of defending here in this position, of course, but it's the best it gets. After king g7, yeah, rook a5 immediately also. It's the same thing. That's what I have as my main line. Rook d8 and if rook b5, you can see we're back on the only moves straight here. Rook d6, defending everything in a funny way. White will have to move the bishop and we can get closer with the king. White is still slightly better, don't get that wrong, but it's definitely defendable. It's way more pleasant than the initial position. Just one plan here for black might be to try to bring the king to protect his pawn, which would mean that the knight could later on take up other tasks, perhaps to bring the knight somewhere. So still not completely solved, but definitely defendable. What happened here was that black's task was very counterintuitive. The only way to really save black here, we had a threat of rook b8. There was also some idea maybe with fixing the pawns with d4. The only way out here was to play a move that we didn't want to play. Bishop takes e5, very surprising. Knight takes e5 and now rook f8. Strange as it may seem, but this is the way we have to continue here in order to eliminate that pawn on b6. That's our only chance. Very difficult to see this over the board. We need to have a really open mind to accept moves like that. All right, time for our last example. I have a painstaking rook end game to show you also, but very interesting, which I think we can learn from. Please have a look at this position, and you're playing with white pieces here. Try to understand what's going on. That's right, material is equal and it's a rook endgame, so that by definition should offer good chances. However, we have at least two big problems here. One, black has a far advanced passed pawn. Two, our king side is also a bit weak. They're trying to attack it right now with a rook, but also they could consider at some point bringing the king to attack our pawns on the king side. So we have two difficult dangers, you could say, two big dangers that we have to deal with somehow. Very difficult to save such endgames. It's very easy to go wrong. It's a little like the process of elimination here. You have to go through all the options and try to establish which is the best one. So let's start with the most obvious move. Save the pawn, h4. This is bad for several reasons, but one reason is that this pawn on g3 becomes very weak, so black gets like an additional target apart from the plan of pushing the pawn. So something like rook h2 check, king d3, rook d2 check, and you don't take the pawn. After king c4, you have no reason to take this pawn, of course. Please notice this trade of pawns would only help white. Black is very happy to keep white's king off the d file, so to speak, because this means that they have free hands on the king side or in the center. So e2 would win the game here because, sorry, what black is about to do here, they're about to bring in the king, and white cannot really prevent this in any good way. Here you can definitely see that white's pawn structure is not ideal. That's what could happen if we play h4. If you play king d3, I looked at so many moves here because I thought it was interesting. If you play king d3, is that what you played in the game? No, but it's something similar. Now you give check, and if the king goes up, you can again bring in the king, king g4. This time you're perhaps also targeting that pawn, but you have like a second plan to go king f3. Yeah, looks very difficult for white. This pawn is getting stronger and stronger. So what else could you do here? I'm trying to remember what did white play in the game. Yeah, c3. We should also look at this move, of course. c3, the spirit of trading pawns. It's excellent. It's an excellent defensive idea. The less pawns, the better for the defender, almost always. Unfortunately, after rook takes h2, king d3, rook d2, king c4, black can again resort to the same plan of helping the the pawn, the passed pawn with the king. So king g4 is a killer here. C takes d4, king f3. White, they don't have a chance here. In this race, you can see that it will take ages for white to queen, while black is doing this very quickly, and then their king will be closer to the remaining pawns. Interestingly enough, speaking about trading pawns, please notice that if these pawns were not around, the g and h pawn, it will probably draw here by simply pushing the pawn. So that's something to remember. I touched upon this in Mastering Endgame Strategy. The trades of pawns almost exclusively favor the defending side. That's good to know, opposed to trading pieces. All right, we should check the game now. In the game, white played rook f4. A very well-intended move, because if now king g4 or king e4, you can see that white was about to play rook f4. This would be a big relief for them, of course, to be able to eliminate those pawns. But black in this game, by the way, with white pieces, Opgolds, and black is Bocharov. Bocharov, he replied to rook f8 with king g6, because he needs to keep these pawns on the board. White played at this point rook f4, but now it's not with check, which gives black a few extra tempi here. Rook takes h2. We know this story already. King d3 and rook d2, I was going to say. Yeah, king d3, rook d2, king c4, e2. It's similar to what we just looked at. You can see that one way or another, black will break through here. After rook e4, we will go king f5, I think. And yeah, you can't really prevent this plan. So in the game, after rook takes h2 in the game, they played here instead king e1. Not what white wanted, of course, to have the king cut off. Please notice, don't trade pawns here. Don't take this pawn for now. It's better to first protect this pawn and try to bring the king closer. The game went like that, rook e4, king f5, and it was hopeless for white, because the rook is doing two things at the same time. It's tying black's rook to the pawn, and at the same time it should also make sure that black's king doesn't enter. Well, actually it's doing those two tasks, but black can try to protect this pawn, and in that case the rook can move again. So if rook h4, yeah, you can go king e5 simply here. And now we're threatening to take the pawn. If they take, we invade. I think this is always interesting with rook endgames. They can be pawn down, we can be pawn bound, but we make an easy draw. And here you have the opposite, equal material, but we're completely doomed. Rook h4, king f3, and black soon went on to win here. It's just too much for white to handle. You can see that even there are mating ideas such as take and rook c1, well, not mate, but almost. No, rook d1, take, and king f2, things like that. Activity prevails here. Now black is way more active than white. Okay, I think it's time for us to look at the right choice here. The only way to save this difficult endgame. We saw in several lines that black king would like to enter on g4, and that explains why it's best move here. Not intuitive at all, at least if you ask me. You got it, h3. Imagine you're at move 52 or something, and you have to find this move h3. Completely, unexpected. No, h3. Rook takes h3, we will then play king d3, and we're just in time to eliminate those pawns. Please notice rook takes, king takes, black is like one tempo short here, I think, or perhaps even more, because we simply threaten to take, our king is close enough, and king f4 makes no sense. We will just give check here and pick up the pawn. Next turn, I think, right? c4, yeah, I think so. King f3, yeah, you can take, but you can also keep the rooks on, and then in the very worst case, you can sack on the pawn, right? And you have this king and pawn versus rook, if this didn't work. But it does work, right? Yeah, we can check it, of course. Yeah, white is also queening here, and there are no skewers in the end. Yeah, no skewers in the end, so we definitely make a draw here also. So h3, the best move. Black should not take on h3. They should play their usual move, rook h2, so that they can play rook d2 and keep track of the d pawn. So let's see what happens here. King d3, rook d2, king c4. If you remember, we actually had this position, but with the pawn on h4. On that occasion, we concluded that black would be able to enter with the king. But this is not possible this time. At the same time, you can see that the rook is busy defending the pawn on d4, so black, they don't have so many options here. Rook takes, we just take back, and the pawn is, we can take it later. So e2 would be the most critical move. Black plays e2, and they're hoping to, even by using a sacrifice, they're hoping to bring the king closer. And I think I had this as an exercise also. I tortured some students with this position, and it's difficult because we're so used to active defense being the best choice in endgames. But there are cases where a passive defense is preferable, and this is one of them. White is somehow zugzwang here. As you can see, it's not easy to find a move for white. For example, c3, d3 should be avoided definitely. So you can't make many moves here. If you touch these pawns, you will make it easier for black to enter and so on. So the only way you can lose a tempo here is either using the rook or using the king. So what do you think? If you need to lose a tempo, would you lose it with the king or would you lose it with a rook? Which would be most logical? You're right. It's not bad to use some general considerations also. If you lose a tempo with the king, you move away the king from the battlefield, which by simple comparison must be useful for black. So here black can use the idea that I mentioned. They can sack a pawn to bring the king closer. They can play here h4, and after g takes, they can bring in the king here. G takes, king f4. But I think you only win by one tempo here. Yeah, let's see. h5, white is running with their new pass pawn. King f3, h6. Now we should, I think, first we should take the pawn, because if you go king f2, I think h7, this is even bad for white, for black. So we take on c2, rook takes c2, they take on d4, and what do you think black should play here? That's right, there is only one move here. Endgames are filled with tactics. That's good to know. Many tricks which are not evident in the first place. Exactly. Rook c8. This move is very smart because we win a tempo. We are moving the rook to the 8th rank so that we can give checks later on, and this will help our defensive task. Is that the right way to explain it? Probably not. No, rook c8, the point of rook c8 is simply that we don't want the pawn to queen. But we could use that check, but I think it's quite the opposite actually. We won't use the check. Yeah, you'll see what I mean. After rook e7, now we start pushing the pawn here. We help it with the king, king f2. They will have to give check with rook f7, and we will have to hide the king on e1. The problem for white is exactly that. The king is in the wrong place. That if they go back with the rook to e7, we will play king d2. This is the point. This is why black wins this game, because white's king is in the wrong place. So I was saying the wrong thing. Yeah, definitely don't give check, because in that case, white's king would have gone that way and they would have more checking options. So this is the way black will play. You can see that the pawn will queen and white's king is too far away from helping the pawns. This would win rather easily, I think, with the black pieces. So that's the reason why this won't work for us. What else did I look at here? King e3. King e3, yeah, that's what you could try, of course, so that if king d1, you would give check. But this won't happen because black, of course, will give check themselves. And then they will hide the king next turn, king d3, king d1, something like that. And again, it's the same story. They can't check us, so we will queen. So back to the key position here after e2, we're talking about losing a tempo. The king should not move away, we need to keep it close. So actually the right choice here is just to wait. Rook e7, very difficult to do this, I would say. Well, you can find it by a process of elimination, but in general terms, it's difficult to make that conclusion that, we should just wait, because it goes a little against the typical idea of active defense. So rook e7, and if now black carries out the same idea, they don't have many choices. Again, rook takes, king takes just helps white's task. So h4 will be the most critical move. We need to quickly create that passed pawn. G takes, h4, king f4, h5. By simple comparison, we are a tempo up, you could say, because the king is on c4 instead. The exact location of white's rook is not that important. You will see that the king's placement is a bigger factor here. King f3, h5, rook takes e2, and we will simply play here the move king d3. I think we can get away with this, but that means some kind of fortress. I think if you play like that, they will play rook c7. Yeah, you don't want this, of course, but I think the computer was saying that you could actually save this also, this endgame. But yeah, like this, right? But who would enter this if you have a choice? It's much nicer, of course. In this course, throughout the course, I'm trying to focus on the most practical moves. So king d3, of course, because that's the pawn that we would like to take, right? Rook c3 and king d2, you can see that by now it's a different story. Black, they don't get to the same situation that they had previously, because our king was much closer. No, if you compare this, I don't know if this was evident, but we had this position in the other line. The king was already on c5, so we played king takes d4, and black played rook c8, and there was no fortress because the rook is on c8. I think, yeah, I don't know how interesting is this, but I think what this is about is that in the other line, if we go back to king c5 and h4 and all that, if you remember this line, if you take on c8, this is not a fortress. I'm back, by the way, in the king c5 line. Now if white loses the tempo in the wrong way. So after rook c8, if white takes on c8, we will queen, and I think this is not a fortress because Simply when you go h7, I can pick up the pawn in some way, or I could even pick up the rook. Yeah, think of something like queen h4 and take the pawn. While in our other case, since after e2 we played rook e7, then the pawn will be protected, right? The pawn will be protected on h7. So after h4 and take and king f4 and all this mainland that we looked at, you can see that you could probably get away with this. That's what I'm trying to say. You could get away with this rook c7 and you take on c7, because here after queen h7 you can't pick up. I mean, you could maybe pick up the rook, but then white will queen, so you can't win this. But why enter this if we can play like that instead? Much nicer, no? So that's the big difference here. King d3, rook c3, check. Black is trying to get back into the other line, but we're not interested in that. We play king d2, of course, and it's black who should already be a little careful here, because our pawn is also running, so they'll probably just have to go back with the rook or something and make a draw here. So that's what would have happened if white had found the whole way. But I mean, this is very, very difficult, because also in the endgame we're low on time, and it's difficult to see all these precise moves. So h3 in any case, that's the key move here. And later on, it was very important for white to play this waiting move with the rook. Now rook h2, king d3, rook d2, king c4, e2, rook e7. This was very important. I think when I checked this, I think almost all the moves were only moves. That's good to know. There was no space for, no margin, you could say, in this example. Every move was the only move. That's difficult for any chess player. All right, I think this was the last example. So if we do a quick recap here, we can start with first example. Evidently, we saw this fierce battle. Gokar Khan's king was in big danger, but he noticed that bringing in the rook to f1, we protect the pawn, and after black's check on g5, king h2, queen g4, I was going to say, but rook g4 is more powerful, threatening rook h4. It was important for white to give up that pawn on f2 by playing rook g1 after queen takes f2. There was another only move that they had to play here, rook g2, and white was eventually rewarded for their precise defensive play. We saw in Zhu Jiangyi's example, crazy example, that's how he ended up. He exposed his king in this way, but this was the only way to keep the balance. Some very cold-blooded calculation, and he relied also on his own counterattack. Not every day you can put your king in the middle like that, especially if we go back a few moves. This for me is like the most striking moment after king f1 or queen h4 if you like first. Rook takes g2. Striking decision here that he says, all right, you can have your checks on g1 and g2. In most other games that would be decisive, but he noticed that this would not be the case, that he can actually get away with this. Rook g1, king f2, queen g2, and king e3. Yeah, incredible. And he later on managed to save his skin here, relying on the perpetual. We saw the complex battle between Søndergaard and Rasmussen. Well, black had to rely on this knight move, giving away the knight, because they knew that they could disrupt white's queen sacrifice, or the attacking play by white here, since after bishop takes f6, we could give check on d2 and then give check on b4 and finally sacrifice back, or however you like to put it, queen takes b2 and we take back. But this was difficult to see. Definitely we're talking about a string of only moves here. Christopher Yu bravely accepted the opponent's sacrifice. He lost the queen, but he managed to put up some kind of fortress with his 3 minor pieces, holding their own against black's queen. Very, very impressive. He didn't see any ghosts. He was ready to do this. I think most of us would be very afraid to play something like that. We would think that we're getting destroyed, but yeah, he was very, very precise in his play here. Rook takes f2, bishop takes f2, and king f1, avoiding all the pitfalls such as taking and getting mated. We saw the fantastic example, Lauritz and Chakraborty, where this strange knight maneuver to f5 solved all white's problems. Rook takes f8, king g7, rook f7, king takes knight e6, king g6, knight f5. Yeah, incredible, but this is actually working. You just have to be ready to expose your king a little in the very end. Queen h2, king f2. Believe it or not, white is perfectly fine here. We saw in the first endgame example that the, you could say, anti-intuitive continuation here, taking on c5, exactly what white wanted. Knight takes e5, rook f8. This was the only way to go, because in that way we can target the pawn on b6. By the way, I forgot to mention also d4. That's another obvious move, right? To open up the bishop towards the knight on b3, but also it opens up the other bishop, I mean white's bishop, so white could just take on b7, so this would be a disaster also. So very difficult to make this choice. Bishop takes, knight takes, and rook f8. That's a true heroic defense in the endgame, you could say, playing moves that don't look too nice, no, if you look at them in the first place. And we saw this very troublesome rook endgame, very tricky rook endgame. White had to find several only moves, but if we go to the very beginning, I would say this was the main difficulty, to opt for this move h3, to understand that that's the right way to give up the pawn, because eventually you have to give up something here. But it was very, very important not to let black's king enter, and for that reason the move h3 was the only real choice here. But then there were some delicate situations where you have to lose a tempo with rook e7 and so on. All right, thanks a lot, and see you in the next chapter.